Margaret Williams sat at her kitchen table, staring at the crisp white envelope that had arrived by courier that morning. The familiar scent of lavender from her garden drifted through the open window, a stark contrast to the cold legal language printed on expensive letterhead. She had been expecting this moment for months, ever since Richard's funeral, but seeing the words in black and white still sent a chill through her 6-to-2-year-old frame. The letter was brief and brutal. 48 hours to vacate the premises. No exceptions. No extensions. The Riverside Manor estate, with its sprawling gardens and century-old oak trees, would no longer be her home, according to Richard's children from his first marriage. They had made their intentions clear from the moment the will was read, but Margaret had hoped their grief might soften their resolve. She had been wrong. Speaking of homes and family situations, I'm curious where you're watching this from today. Are you in your own family home, or maybe dealing with your own property challenges? Drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're tuning in from. Rachel Morrison, Richard's 38-year-old daughter, had inherited her father's piercing blue eyes, but none of his kindness. She arrived at the estate that afternoon in her silver BMW, designer heels clicking against the brick walkway with military precision. Her younger brother David followed in his black Mercedes, both vehicles worth more than most people earned in a year. They entered the house without knocking, treating the space as if Margaret was already gone. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway as Rachel surveyed the living room with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. The younger woman wore a perfectly tailored cream suit that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. David, 2 years younger but equally polished in his navy suit, examined the antique furniture with obvious dollar signs in his eyes. "We never wanted her here in the first place," Rachel announced to her brother, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "She acts like she belongs, but everyone knows what she really was." David nodded in agreement, running his manicured fingers along the mahogany dining table where Margaret had served thousands of meals over the past 15 years. "A gold digger who got lucky when Dad's judgment got cloudy in his old age," he replied. "At least now we can fix his mistake." Margaret remained silent, observing from the shadows as she had learned to do during the difficult final years of Richard's illness. She had become expert at making herself invisible, at anticipating needs before they were voiced, at providing comfort without expecting gratitude. The skills had served her well as Richard's condition deteriorated, but they seemed to confirm his children's low opinion of her capabilities. The siblings moved through the house with proprietary confidence, discussing which pieces they would sell and which they might keep for their own homes. They spoke about Margaret as if she were an unwelcome pest who had finally been exterminated, their voices growing bolder with each room they claimed. The library where Margaret spent most evenings reading would become David's home office. The sunroom where she tended her orchids would be converted into a wine cellar. "She won't cause trouble, will she?" David asked his sister as they examined the master bedroom where Richard had spent his final months. Margaret had converted half the space into a medical area, complete with hospital bed and monitoring equipment, all of which she had researched and arranged herself. Rachel laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Look at her, David. She's been hiding in that kitchen like a scared mouse since we got here. What's she going to do, call a lawyer? With what money? Dad made sure she got exactly what she deserved in the will. Nothing." Their attorney, James Whitfield, arrived an hour later in a gleaming black Bentley that seemed to announce his success before he even stepped out. Whitfield was a man who understood the language of wealth, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit clearly bespoke. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and spoke with the confident authority of someone who had never lost a case that mattered. "The legal documentation is ironclad," Whitfield assured the siblings as they gathered in Richard's former study. "Your father's will explicitly states that the property passes to his biological children upon his death. The woman has no legal standing whatsoever. She was never formally adopted, never legally recognized as family, and the prenuptial agreement she signed waives any claim to marital property." Margaret continued her quiet observation, noting how Whitfield's expensive cologne filled the room and how his gold cufflinks caught the afternoon light streaming through the bay windows. She had seen men like him before, lawyers who treated the law as a weapon for those who could afford to wield it. His confidence was absolute, his manner dismissive of any potential complications. "What if she refuses to leave?" Rachel asked, settling into her father's leather chair behind the massive oak desk. The chair seemed to swallow her small frame, but her voice remained strong and determined. Whitfield smiled, the expression predatory rather than reassuring. "Then we proceed with formal eviction. The sheriff's department will remove her and her belongings. Any resistance will result in trespassing charges. I've handled dozens of these cases, Mrs. Morrison. Gold diggers rarely have the resources or knowledge to mount any real defense." David poured himself a generous glass of his father's aged whiskey, not bothering to offer any to his sister or their attorney. The crystal decanter had been a wedding gift from Margaret's side of the family, though she doubted any of them remembered or cared about such details. "Perfect," he said, raising the glass in a mock toast, "to finally getting our house back." Margaret retreated to her small upstairs bedroom, the only space in the house that had truly felt like hers during 15 years of marriage. She sat on the narrow bed where she had spent countless sleepless nights listening for Richard's labored breathing, ready to assist with medications or emergency calls to his doctors. The room was sparse, containing only the essentials she had brought from her previous life and a few personal items Richard had given her over the years. From her window, she could see Rachel and David walking the grounds with Whitfield, pointing out various features and discussing the property's market value. They moved with the easy confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world, never questioned their right to claim what they wanted. Their expensive clothes and perfect posture spoke of lives cushioned by privilege and protected by inherited wealth. As evening approached, the siblings and their lawyer departed with promises to return in 48 hours with the sheriff and moving trucks. Rachel paused at the front door, looking back at Margaret, who had finally emerged from her bedroom to begin the overwhelming task of packing her life into whatever boxes she could find. "I almost feel sorry for her," Rachel said to David, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "She actually thought she could play house with our father and keep living in our family home. Some people just never learn their place." Margaret closed the front door behind them and stood alone in the grand foyer where Richard had carried her over the threshold 15 years earlier. The silence felt different now, heavier with the weight of impending loss and the echoes of cruel words. She had expected this fight from the moment Richard first mentioned his children's resentment, but experiencing their contempt firsthand still left her feeling hollow and small. Yet as she climbed the stairs to begin packing, Margaret's steps carried a strange steadiness that hadn't been there during the afternoon's humiliation. In her bedroom, she pulled a small fireproof box from beneath her bed and carefully removed several documents that she had kept safe for over a decade. Her fingers traced the official seals and legal stamps, documents that told a very different story than the one Rachel and David had constructed about her place in their father's life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she knew the siblings would return with absolute confidence in their victory. But tonight, alone in the house where she had loved and lost and quietly endured, Margaret Williams allowed herself the smallest of smiles as she began making phone calls that would soon change everything. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Margaret's somber mood as she descended the stairs to find Rachel and David already inside the house. They had let themselves in with Richard's old keys, their designer shoes leaving muddy tracks across the Persian rugs that Margaret had carefully maintained for over a decade. Rachel wore a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car, while David sported a navy blazer that screamed expensive education and inherited privilege. "We're doing a complete inventory," Rachel announced without preamble, her voice echoing through the foyer as if she owned the place. She held a tablet and stylus, ready to catalog every valuable item in the house. "Everything needs to be documented before you leave, just so there's no confusion about what belongs to whom." Margaret poured herself coffee in the kitchen, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. Through the window, she watched David directing two men in coveralls who were photographing the exterior of the property, documenting every detail from the rose gardens to the antique fountain. The methodical nature of their approach spoke of careful planning, as if they had been preparing for this moment long before Richard's death. David entered the kitchen with his tablet, scanning the room like a predator evaluating prey. The copper pots hanging above the island, the vintage cast iron cookware, even the ceramic dishes that Margaret had collected over years of careful shopping, all became items on his digital checklist. He photographed everything without asking permission, treating her presence as irrelevant to the process. "These pots look expensive," he commented to his sister, who had joined him in cataloging the kitchen contents. "Probably worth a few thousand at auction. Good thing we're getting everything documented properly." Margaret sipped her coffee and watched them work, remembering the countless hours she had spent in this kitchen preparing meals for Richard during his illness. She had researched specialized diets for his various conditions, learning to prepare low-sodium meals that would still tempt his failing appetite, studying nutrition guides, and consulting with dietitians to ensure every meal supported his recovery efforts. The memory of grinding fresh herbs for his tea, of staying up late preparing batch meals he could manage when she wasn't there to help, felt distant now as David reduced her carefully chosen tools to mere auction lots. Rachel discovered the photo albums Margaret kept in the living room cabinet, documenting Richard's final years and their quiet life together. The younger woman flipped through the pages with obvious distaste, pausing at images of Margaret assisting Richard with his physical therapy exercises, helping him navigate the house with his walker, reading to him during long afternoons when pain kept him bedridden. "Look at this performance," Rachel said, holding up a photo of Margaret adjusting Richard's oxygen equipment. She documented everything like she was building some kind of case, probably planning to claim she deserves compensation for playing nurse. David examined the image over his sister's shoulder, his expression cold and calculating. Dad was always too trusting. He never saw how manipulative people could be, especially women who knew exactly what buttons to push. She probably researched everything about caring for sick old men before she even met him. Margaret remained silent, though the accusation stung deeper than she cared to admit. She remembered the genuine terror she had felt during Richard's first heart attack, the frantic calls to emergency services, the nights spent learning CPR and basic medical care, because she couldn't bear the thought of being helpless if he needed her. The photo albums represented her desperate attempt to hold on to memories during a time when everything felt slipping away, not some calculated documentation project. By midday, the siblings had moved their inventory operation to the second floor, their voices carrying through the house as they discussed the value of family heirlooms and antique furniture. Margaret retreated to the small garden shed behind the house, ostensibly to sort through gardening supplies, but really to escape the constant reminders of her precarious situation. The shed had become her refuge during Richard's illness, a place where she could tend to something growing and hopeful while watching him slowly fade away. Inside the weathered wooden structure, surrounded by carefully organized tools and seed packets, Margaret pulled out her phone and placed a call to a number she had memorized years earlier but never expected to use. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of precise legal language that would have surprised anyone who had witnessed her quiet demeanor over the past 2 days. "I need to schedule a consultation for tomorrow morning," she said quietly into the phone. "The documentation we discussed is going to be necessary sooner than anticipated." "Yes, I still have all the original paperwork in the fireproof box." "No, they have no idea what they're actually dealing with." When she returned to the house, Margaret found that news of her impending eviction had somehow spread through their small community. Rachel had been making phone calls, she realized, probably to mutual acquaintances and neighbors who had known Richard for decades. The story being told painted Margaret as a scheming opportunist who had taken advantage of a sick old man, finally getting her comeuppance from his rightful heirs. Mrs. Patterson from next door appeared at the front door that afternoon, her expression sympathetic but tinged with the kind of curiosity that comes from hearing scandalous gossip. "I heard about your situation, dear," she said, glancing past Margaret toward the interior of the house, where Rachel could be heard directing the inventory process. "If you need help packing or finding somewhere temporary to stay, my church has resources for women in difficult circumstances." Margaret thanked her neighbor politely, recognizing the kindness beneath the slightly condescending offer. Mrs. Patterson meant well, but her assumption that Margaret was helpless and without resources reflected the careful image Margaret had cultivated over the years. She had learned early in her marriage to Richard that his children responded better to step-parents who seemed non-threatening, who asked for nothing and claimed even less. That evening, Rachel and David celebrated their progress at the country club, their voices carrying across the parking lot as Margaret happened to drive past on her way back from the grocery store. They sat on the covered terrace, sharing expensive wine and congratulating themselves on their efficient handling of an awkward situation. "She's been completely cooperative," David told a small group of friends who had joined them for dinner. "No drama, no attempts to fight the inevitable. I think she finally realizes she was living in a fantasy and it's time to face reality." Rachel raised her wine glass in a mock toast, her laughter bright and cruel in the evening air. "To getting our family home back from the help," she announced. "Sometimes you have to be firm with people who don't understand boundaries." Margaret sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot, listening to their celebration through her open window. The casual cruelty of their words, the easy assumption that she would simply disappear without complaint, spoke to a lifetime of privilege that had never been challenged or questioned. They had never considered that she might have resources, connections, or knowledge that could complicate their simple narrative of inheritance and entitlement. Back at the house, Margaret spent the evening carefully packing her personal belongings while organizing documents that would soon prove crucial to her defense. She worked with methodical precision, each item placed with purpose rather than panic. In her bedroom, she reviewed files that contained information about property law, inheritance regulations, and documentation requirements, knowledge she had acquired through years of quiet study that no one had bothered to notice or question. Her phone rang several times throughout the evening, brief conversations conducted in professional tones that revealed glimpses of connections and resources that Rachel and David would never have suspected. Margaret confirmed appointments, reviewed strategies, and ensured that every piece of documentation would be available when needed. Her voice remained calm and measured, betraying none of the nervous energy that had sustained her through 2 days of systematic humiliation. As she prepared for bed, Margaret stood at her bedroom window overlooking the gardens she had tended for 15 years. The roses were blooming despite the recent rain, their deep red petals a splash of color against the gray evening sky. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when Rachel and David's confident assumptions would collide with reality in ways they could never have anticipated. She smiled slightly as she pulled the curtains closed, remembering Richard's often repeated advice about the importance of patience and preparation. He had been a methodical man himself, someone who understood that the most significant victories often came to those who were willing to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal their true strength. The courthouse stood like a monument to justice on Main Street, its granite columns and imposing facade suggesting the weight of law and order that governed civilized society. Rachel Morrison emerged from her silver BMW that morning wearing a midnight blue suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, her auburn hair styled in a perfect chignon that spoke of expensive salon appointments and unlimited time for personal grooming. She walked with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world, her Italian leather heels clicking against the courthouse steps with military precision. David followed close behind in his charcoal gray suit, the fabric clearly tailored to his lean frame by craftsmen who understood how clothing could project power and authority. His tie was silk, his cufflinks were gold, and his briefcase was the kind of buttery leather that improved with age and cost. Together, the siblings presented the image of inherited wealth and unquestioned privilege, people for whom the legal system had always been a tool rather than an obstacle. James Whitfield arrived in his black Bentley precisely at 9:30, stepping onto the courthouse plaza with the bearing of a general preparing for a battle he had already won. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the morning humidity, and his bespoke suit fit like armor designed specifically for legal warfare. He carried a massive briefcase that seemed to announce the depth of his preparation, along with a leather portfolio that bulged with what appeared to be extensive documentation supporting his client's case. The attorney's confidence was infectious, spreading to Rachel and David as they followed him up the courthouse steps. "This will be over in an hour," Whitfield assured them, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a case that mattered to his reputation. "The documentation is absolutely clear. Your father's will, the property records, the prenuptial agreement she signed. She has no legal standing whatsoever, and any competent judge will see that immediately. Inside the courthouse, the siblings claimed seats in the front row of the gallery, their expensive clothes and obvious wealth drawing respectful attention from court personnel and other attorneys waiting for their cases to be heard. Rachel arranged her designer handbag and matching coat with the casual precision of someone accustomed to being watched and admired, while David checked his platinum watch and made quiet phone calls to business associates who would be impressed by his presence in court defending family property rights. Whitfield spread his materials across the plaintiff's table with theatrical precision, creating an impressive display of legal documents, property records, and bound depositions that suggested months of meticulous preparation. The sheer volume of paperwork seemed to announce his superiority over any opposition, particularly the kind of bargain basement legal representation that someone in Margaret's circumstances could afford. His gold fountain pen gleamed under the courtroom lights as he organized his attack strategy with the confidence of a master craftsman. Margaret arrived exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled hearing, entering through the courthouse's main entrance without fanfare or pretension. She wore a simple navy dress that looked like something from a department store clearance rack, her graying hair pulled back in a modest bun that suggested someone who had given up on vanity years earlier. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, chosen for comfort over style, and she carried only a small canvas bag that seemed to contain the entirety of her legal defense. Behind her walked a man in his 50s wearing an unremarkable brown suit that had seen better days. Thomas Chun appeared to be exactly the kind of public defender that someone without resources might scrape together at the last minute. His briefcase scuffed from years of use, and his tie slightly crooked in a way that suggested hurried preparation. He moved without the commanding presence that marked expensive legal representation, consulting a small notebook as if still learning the details of the case. "Look at her lawyer," Rachel whispered to David, not bothering to lower her voice enough to prevent nearby observers from overhearing. "He looks like he just graduated from some community college night school program. This is going to be even easier than we thought." David nodded with obvious amusement, pulling out his phone to text friends about the spectacle they were about to witness. His message described the pathetic legal representation their stepmother had managed to secure, complete with jokes about bargain basement attorneys and desperate people making foolish choices. The responses came quickly, a stream of laughing emojis and congratulations on their inevitable victory. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of someone who had presided over thousands of cases during his 20-year tenure on the bench. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed and his black robes carrying the weight of judicial authority. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for legal games and time-wasting presentations, qualities that had earned him respect from the local bar association and fear from attorneys who came to his courtroom unprepared. The hearing began with Whitfield's opening presentation, a masterful display of legal theater that immediately established his command of the courtroom. He spoke with the polished authority of someone accustomed to addressing judges, juries, and opposing counsel from a position of intellectual and financial superiority. His voice carried clearly through the courtroom as he outlined what he described as a straightforward case of property inheritance and legal clarity. "Your Honor," Whitfield began, his tone suggesting that the outcome was so obvious that the hearing was merely a formality. "The facts in this case are unambiguous and supported by extensive documentation. Richard Morrison, the deceased property owner, left clear instructions in his legally executed will regarding the disposition of his estate. The Riverside Manor property passes directly to his biological children, Rachel Morrison and David Morrison, without any claim or interest remaining for the woman who briefly married him during his final years." Whitfield moved to an easel where he had prepared charts and property records that seemed to tell an irrefutable story of inheritance law and family rights. His presentation was polished and professional, each document referenced with the precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The siblings watched from the gallery with obvious satisfaction, their expressions suggesting complete confidence in their attorney's superior preparation and expertise. The prenuptial agreement, signed by the defendant prior to her marriage to the deceased, explicitly waives any claim to marital property in the event of death or divorce, Whitfield continued, holding up a document for the judge's examination. Furthermore, Your Honor, there is no evidence of adoption, legal guardianship, or any other relationship that would grant the defendant standing to challenge the clear terms of the deceased's will. Judge Harrison examined the documents with careful attention, his expression neutral but clearly engaged with the legal arguments being presented. He asked several clarifying questions about dates and signatures, nodding thoughtfully as Whitfield provided detailed answers that demonstrated his thorough preparation. The attorney's confidence seemed to increase with each exchange, his responses becoming more elaborate and theatrical as he sensed the judge's initial receptiveness to his arguments. Rachel and David exchanged satisfied glances as their lawyer dominated the courtroom proceedings, their expensive clothes and obvious wealth clearly impressing the court personnel and gallery observers. Several people in the courthouse had recognized them as members of one of the community's most prominent families, lending additional weight to their legal position and social standing. Their presence suggested serious money behind serious legal representation, the kind of resources that usually prevailed in property disputes. Margaret sat quietly at the defendant's table, her modest appearance contrasting sharply with the expensive legal presentation unfolding against her. She took occasional notes in a simple spiral notebook, her handwriting neat and precise despite the stress of the situation. Her attorney, Thomas Chun, listened to Whitfield's arguments without objection, occasionally whispering brief comments that seemed more observational than strategic. The gallery began to fill with local residents who had heard about the hearing through the community gossipine that had been actively fed by Rachel and David's publicity campaign. Most observers clearly expected to witness the final chapter of what they had been told was a gold digger's failed attempt to steal a family's rightful inheritance. The atmosphere in the courtroom suggested a foregone conclusion, with spectators settling in to watch justice efficiently delivered to someone who had overreached her proper place in society. Whitfield concluded his opening presentation with a flourish, spreading additional documents across the evidence table in a display that seemed designed more for theatrical impact than legal necessity. Your Honor, he announced with obvious satisfaction, I believe the evidence speaks for itself. This is simply a case of clear legal documentation versus wishful thinking. The defendant has no legal standing, no valid claim, and no realistic hope of challenging my client's obvious rights to their family property. Judge Harrison thanked the attorney for his presentation and turned his attention to the defendant's table, where Thomas Chun was quietly organizing a small folder of documents. The contrast between the two legal teams was stark and obvious to everyone in the courtroom, from the expensive suits and bulging briefcases on one side to the modest clothing and simple materials on the other. The visual disparity seemed to confirm the expected outcome before a single word of defense had been spoken. Mr. Chun, Judge Harrison said with professional courtesy, you may present your client's position. Chun stood slowly, his unremarkable appearance drawing sympathetic glances from gallery observers who seemed to recognize a David facing an obvious Goliath. Thank you, Your Honor, he said quietly, his voice lacking the theatrical projection that had marked Whitfield's presentation. My client appreciates the court's time and attention in this matter. We would like to present some additional documentation that may be relevant to the property ownership question. Whitfield shifted in his chair with obvious impatience, his expression suggesting that he was prepared to demolish whatever desperate legal arguments the defense might attempt. Rachel leaned forward in her gallery seat, her phone ready to capture what she expected would be her stepmother's humiliating legal defeat. David checked his watch again, already planning the celebratory dinner that would mark their complete victory over someone who had dared to challenge their family's rightful inheritance. Judge Harrison nodded for Chun to proceed, though his expression suggested that he too expected the defense presentation to be brief and ultimately unsuccessful. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret's attorney reached into his modest briefcase, withdrawing a folder that seemed insignificant compared to the mountains of documentation that Whitfield had presented. The moment felt like the final scene of a play where the outcome had been obvious from the opening curtain. Yet something in Thomas Chen's careful movements, in the precise way he handled the simple folder, suggested that appearances might be deceiving. Margaret watched him with calm attention, her expression betraying none of the anxiety that might be expected from someone facing imminent legal defeat. Instead, she seemed almost serene, as if she possessed information that would soon change the entire dynamic of the courtroom proceedings. Thomas Chen opened the modest folder with deliberate care, his movements precise despite his unremarkable appearance. The first document he withdrew was a property deed, the paper slightly yellowed with age but clearly official with its embossed seal and notarized signatures. He placed it on the evidence table where Judge Harrison could examine it, the simple gesture carrying more weight than all of Whitfield's theatrical presentations combined. "Your Honor," Chen said quietly, "this is the original property deed for Riverside Manor, recorded with the county clerk's office on March 15, 2010. As you can see, the sole owner listed is Margaret Elizabeth Williams, now Margaret Williams Morrison, following her marriage to the deceased Richard Morrison in 2011. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison leaned forward to examine the document, his reading glasses reflecting the overhead lights as he studied the official seals and signatures. Whitfield's confident expression began to shift, a small line appearing between his eyebrows as he processed the implications of what was being presented. Rachel and David exchanged confused glances from the gallery, their earlier confidence wavering as they tried to understand how their stepmother could possibly possess a property deed predating her marriage to their father. This document indicates continuous ownership from 2010 through the present date, Chun continued, producing additional paperwork from his folder. Here are the property tax records showing annual payments made by Margaret Williams Morrison, never missed, never late, for the past 14 years. The payments were made from her personal account, not from any joint marital assets or funds belonging to the deceased. Whitfield shot to his feet with the urgency of someone watching his carefully constructed case begin to crumble. "Objection, Your Honor. These documents haven't been properly authenticated or verified through the county records office. Anyone can produce photocopies and claim they represent official documentation. I demand that the court require proper chain of custody and official verification before considering any of this alleged evidence." Judge Harrison examined the documents more carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he noted the official seals, watermarks, and registration numbers that marked genuine county records. "Mr. Chun," he said, "these appear to be original documents rather than copies. Can you explain how your client came to possess the original deed if, as the plaintiff claims, she has no legal standing regarding this property?" Chen nodded respectfully, withdrawing another set of documents from his folder. "Your Honor, Margaret Williams inherited the Riverside Manor property from her first husband, James Williams, who purchased it in 1998 and lived there until his death from cancer in 2009. The property passed to his wife under his will, which was properly executed and probated through this same court system. She became the sole legal owner a full year before she ever met Richard Morrison." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow, causing Rachel to gasp audibly and David to drop his phone with a sharp crack against the hardwood floor. Their faces had gone pale beneath their expensive makeup and grooming, the color draining away as they realized the foundation of their entire case was built on false assumptions. Whitfield's theatrical confidence evaporated completely, replaced by the desperate scrambling of an attorney who had just discovered his clients had provided him with completely inaccurate information. "That's impossible," Rachel called out from the gallery, her voice cracking with shock and rising panic. "She lived in some tiny apartment when she met our father. She had nothing, no money, no property, no family connections. We checked her background thoroughly before Dad married her." Judge Harrison fixed Rachel with a stern look that immediately silenced her outburst. "Ma'am, you will remain silent or be removed from my courtroom. This is a legal proceeding, not a family argument, and I will not tolerate interruptions from the gallery regardless of your personal relationship to the case." Chun continued his presentation with methodical precision, each new document delivered like another nail in the coffin of the siblings' assumptions. "Your Honor, here is the original will of James Williams, properly executed and witnessed, leaving all his property to his beloved wife Margaret. Here is the death certificate confirming his passing in 2009. Here are the utility records showing continuous service to Margaret Williams at the Riverside Manor address from 2010 through the present day. Margaret sat quietly at the defendant's table, her transformation from meek victim to composed property owner becoming more apparent with each revelation. Her posture had straightened, her hands rested calmly on the table rather than fidgeting with nervous energy, and her eyes held a clarity that suggested someone finally able to speak her truth after years of being dismissed and underestimated. The modest woman who had seemed powerless against the family's wealth and legal resources was revealing herself to be someone with deep roots and legitimate standing. Whitfield frantically shuffled through his extensive documentation, searching for anything that might counter the mounting evidence of his client's fundamental error. His expensive fountain pen trembled slightly as he made notes, his earlier theatrical confidence replaced by the desperate energy of someone watching a sure victory transform into a humiliating defeat. The mountain of paperwork he had prepared so carefully was proving worthless against the simple truth contained in Chen's modest folder. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, his voice strained and lacking its earlier authority, "I request a brief recess to consult with my clients regarding these unexpected developments. It's clear that there has been some miscommunication about the basic facts of this case, and I need time to verify the authenticity of these documents through independent sources." Chen stood to respond, his quiet voice carrying new authority as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, these documents are all matters of public record, available for verification through the county clerk's office where they were originally filed and have been maintained for over a decade. There is nothing unexpected about property deeds and wills that have been properly recorded and accessible to anyone who bothered to conduct basic research before filing legal actions." The judge's growing irritation with the plaintiff's legal team was becoming obvious to everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Whitfield," he said with barely concealed annoyance, "are you telling me that you filed this action without conducting proper title research or verifying your client's actual legal standing regarding the property in question? These are fundamental steps that any competent attorney would complete before making claims about property ownership." David finally found his voice from the gallery, his words tumbling out in a rush of panic and confusion. "Your Honor, we had no idea she owned anything when she married our father. She presented herself as someone who needed financial security, someone who was grateful for the opportunity to marry into our family. She never mentioned having property or wealth of her own." Margaret spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom, her voice calm and clear as she addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I never concealed my property ownership from Richard. He was well aware that I owned the family home where we lived together for 15 years. However, I saw no reason to discuss my financial situation with his adult children, who made their opinion of our marriage quite clear from the beginning." Chun produced another document from his seemingly inexhaustible folder, this one containing photographs and detailed property records that painted a picture of careful stewardship spanning more than a decade. "Your Honor, here is documentation showing the substantial improvements and maintenance that Mrs. Morrison has invested in the property since inheriting it. New roofing, updated electrical systems, landscaping improvements, all funded from her personal accounts and all properly documented for tax purposes." The photographs showed the Riverside Manor estate in various stages of renovation and improvement, clearly demonstrating years of investment and care that went far beyond what a temporary occupant would undertake. Margaret appeared in several images, directing construction workers and consulting with landscapers, her role as the property's owner obvious to anyone examining the evidence objectively. Whitfield made one final desperate attempt to salvage his client's case, his voice taking on the shrill quality of someone grasping for straws. "Your Honor, even if these documents prove property ownership, there remains the question of the deceased's will and his intentions regarding his children's inheritance. Surely the court must consider the moral obligation to provide for biological children over a second wife, regardless of technical property ownership." Judge Harrison's expression darkened at the attorney's suggestion that moral considerations should override legal documentation. "Mr. Whitfield," he said with obvious displeasure, "this court operates according to property law, not moral speculation about what someone might deserve based on their biological relationships." The evidence clearly establishes that Mrs. Morrison has been the legal owner of this property for over a decade, both before and during her marriage to the deceased. Rachel began crying in the gallery, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks as the reality of their situation became undeniable. The property they had assumed belonged to them by birthright, the family estate they had already begun dividing among themselves, had never actually belonged to their father at all. Their stepmother, the woman they had dismissed as a powerless gold digger, owned the house where they had been raised and every improvement their father had made during his residence there. Shin turned to face the siblings directly, his quiet voice carrying new authority as he addressed their assumptions about his client's character and circumstances. Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison chose to marry Richard Morrison for love, not financial gain. She brought considerably more wealth to the marriage than she gained from it, and she has spent 15 years caring for both the man and the property with equal dedication. The suggestion that she was somehow taking advantage of the deceased is not only false, but deeply insulting to a woman who sacrificed greatly for her husband's comfort during his final years. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not from defeat or fear, but from relief at finally having her truth acknowledged in a court of law. She had endured years of subtle and overt disrespect from Richard's children, accepting their treatment because she loved their father and wanted to avoid family conflicts during his illness. Now, with the legal facts finally revealed, she could stop apologizing for her presence in their lives and start asserting her rightful position as the property owner who had welcomed them into her home out of respect for their father's wishes. Whitfield slumped in his chair, the weight of his professional humiliation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. His expensive suit and confident demeanor could not hide the fact that he had failed to conduct basic research before filing a property dispute, exposing himself to potential sanctions and his clients to a countersuit for harassment and legal fees. The Bentley in the parking lot and the platinum cufflinks suddenly seemed like symbols of arrogance rather than success. Judge Harrison began organizing the documents spread across his bench, his movements indicating that the hearing was approaching its conclusion. The evidence presented by the defense had not only demolished the plaintiff's case, but revealed the entire legal action to be based on fundamental misunderstanding of basic property ownership facts. The siblings' confident assumptions about their inheritance rights had collided with documented reality in the most public and humiliating way possible. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses and looked directly at the plaintiff's table, where James Whitfield sat in stunned silence, his expensive suit now seeming like costume jewelry on someone pretending to be successful. The judge's expression carried the weight of judicial authority, mixed with barely contained irritation at having his courtroom used for what had clearly been a frivolous legal action based on fundamental ignorance of basic property law. Based on the evidence presented today, Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, this court finds that Margaret Williams Morrison is and has been the sole legal owner of the Riverside Manor property since March 15, 2010. The plaintiff's claim that she lacks legal standing to remain on the property is not only without merit, but demonstrates a shocking failure to conduct basic title research before filing this action. Rachel Morrison collapsed back into her gallery seat as if physically struck, her designer handbag falling to the floor and spilling its expensive contents across the courthouse's polished hardwood. Her brother David stared at the judge with his mouth slightly open, his platinum watch and gold cufflinks suddenly seeming like gaudy trinkets worn by someone playing dress-up in borrowed clothes. The siblings had entered the courthouse that morning expecting to watch their stepmother's humiliation and legal defeat, only to discover that they were the ones who had been living in a fantasy built on arrogant assumptions. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, his tone growing sharper with each word, this court is deeply troubled by the harassment campaign that appears to have been waged against Mrs. Morrison based on these false claims. The evidence suggests that the plaintiffs attempted to force her from her own property through intimidation and public humiliation, actions that constitute trespassing and potentially criminal harassment. Whitfield finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper rather than the commanding presence he had displayed earlier. Your Honor, my clients were operating under a good faith belief that they had legitimate inheritance rights. There was never any intention to harass or intimidate anyone, merely to protect what they believed was rightfully theirs. The judge's expression suggested that good faith was exactly what he questioned most about the siblings' behavior. "Mr. Whitfield," he replied, "good faith would have required your clients to verify their legal standing before attempting to evict the actual property owner from her own home. Instead, they chose to assume ownership rights they never possessed and proceeded to treat Mrs. Morrison as an unwelcome intruder in her own residence." Margaret stood slowly, her transformation from meek victim to composed property owner now complete in the eyes of everyone present. "Your Honor," she said with quiet dignity, "I would like the court to know that I harbor no ill will toward Richard's children. They are grieving the loss of their father, and grief sometimes clouds judgment. However, I cannot allow them to continue trespassing on my property or spreading false information about my legal status in our community." Thomas Chun nodded respectfully to his client before addressing the court with newfound authority. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison requests that the court issue a formal order confirming her property rights and ordering the defendants to cease all interference with her peaceful enjoyment of her own home. Additionally, we request that all court costs and legal fees be assessed against the plaintiffs who initiated this frivolous action without proper legal foundation." Judge Harrison made notes on his legal pad with sharp, decisive strokes that seemed to punctuate each point against the siblings' case. "The court hereby orders that Rachel Morrison and David Morrison, along with any agents acting on their behalf, are prohibited from entering the Riverside Manor property without the express written permission of the legal owner, Margaret Williams Morrison. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest for criminal trespass." David Morrison jumped to his feet in the gallery, his composure finally cracking completely under the weight of their public humiliation. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courthouse. "She's stolen our family home, manipulated our father, and now you're protecting her theft with legal technicalities. This isn't justice, it's a travesty." "Bailiff," Judge Harrison said calmly, "please escort Mr. Morrison from my courtroom." His outburst demonstrates exactly the kind of harassment and intimidation that Mrs. Morrison has been forced to endure from people who refuse to accept legal reality. Court security immediately moved toward David, their presence making it clear that his wealthy background would not protect him from the consequences of disrupting legal proceedings. Rachel Morrison remained seated, but her sobbing grew louder as the reality of their complete defeat settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The family estate where she had planned to raise her own children, the property she had already begun mentally dividing and redecorating, had never belonged to her family at all. Her stepmother, the woman she had dismissed as a desperate gold digger, owned everything including the very ground beneath the house where Rachel had been raised. Whitfield began hastily packing his expensive briefcase, his movements betraying the desperation of someone trying to escape a professional disaster. "Your Honor," he said without looking up from his frantic organization, "I request permission to withdraw from representing the plaintiffs in this matter. It has become clear that there are significant communication issues between my clients and myself regarding the basic facts of this case." Judge Harrison's expression showed exactly what he thought of attorneys who abandoned their clients the moment cases became difficult. "Permission granted, Mr. Whitfield. However, this court will be filing a report with the State Bar regarding your failure to conduct basic due diligence before filing this action. Professional competence requires more than expensive suits and theatrical presentations." Margaret walked calmly to the evidence table where her property deeds and tax records were displayed, gathering the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their true value. These papers represented not just legal ownership, but 15 years of love, loss, and careful stewardship of a home that had sheltered her through the darkest period of her life. She had inherited the property as a young widow and transformed it into a place of healing where she could build a new life with Richard Morrison. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Harrison said as she prepared to leave the courtroom, "this court apologizes for the harassment you have endured and commends your patience throughout these proceedings. Your grace under pressure reflects well on your character and makes the plaintiff's treatment of you all the more reprehensible." Margaret nodded respectfully to the judge before turning to face Rachel and David one final time. She looked at the siblings who had spent 2 days treating her like an unwelcome stranger in her own home, their expensive clothes and arrogant assumptions now revealed as nothing more than costume and fantasy. "I hope you can find peace with this situation," she said quietly. "Your father loved you both, and that love was never diminished by his affection for me. You will always be welcome to visit his grave, which is located in the family cemetery on my property, but you must arrange those visits through proper channels like any other guests." The siblings sat in stunned silence as Margaret walked out of the courtroom with Thomas Chun, her modest dress and practical shoes somehow carrying more dignity than all their designer finery combined. The woman they had underestimated and dismissed had proven herself to be not just the legal owner of their childhood home, but someone with the grace to offer them access to their father's final resting place despite their cruel treatment of her. Court costs in the amount of $15,000 are assessed against the plaintiffs, Judge Harrison announced to the nearly empty courtroom. This case represents a textbook example of why proper legal research must precede legal action. The court is adjourned. Rachel and David Morrison sat alone in the courthouse gallery, their expensive clothes and wealthy appearances now seeming like elaborate costumes worn by actors in a play that had ended badly for everyone except the woman they had tried so desperately to destroy. 3 months later, Margaret Williams Morrison stood in her garden as the morning sun filtered through the ancient oak trees that had witnessed decades of family drama and quiet triumphs. She wore simple gardening clothes and canvas gloves, tending to the rose bushes that had bloomed magnificently since being freed from the stress of constant legal uncertainty. The property felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of false accusations and threatened displacement had lifted like morning fog burned away by honest sunshine. The transformation in her daily life had been subtle but profound. She no longer walked through her own home with the careful steps of someone trying not to disturb unwelcome guests. The kitchen where she had endured Rachel and David's inventory process now echoed with laughter from neighborhood friends who visited for coffee and conversation. The living room where the siblings had calculated auction values now hosted book club meetings and charity planning sessions for causes Margaret supported with her quietly substantial resources. Mrs. Patterson from next door had become a regular visitor. Her earlier offer of church assistance transformed into genuine friendship once the truth about Margaret's circumstances became known throughout their small community. The older woman had been mortified to learn that she had patronizingly offered help to someone who actually owned one of the most valuable properties in the county. But Margaret had graciously accepted her apologies and welcomed the opportunity to build real connections with neighbors she had kept at arm's length during Richard's illness. The courthouse victory had rippled through the community like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves of gossip and reassessment that reached every social circle where the Morrison family had once held influence. Rachel and David's public humiliation had been thoroughly documented by several observers who attended the hearing, and the story of their arrogant assumptions being demolished by simple legal facts had become a cautionary tale told at dinner parties and coffee shops throughout the region. Rachel Morrison had quietly listed her expensive suburban home for sale within weeks of the courthouse debacle, the financial pressure of legal fees and her husband's business losses forcing a lifestyle adjustment she had never imagined possible. The woman who had confidently planned to inherit a family estate now struggled to maintain appearances while dealing with creditors and lawyers demanding payment for services rendered in her failed legal campaign. Her silver BMW had been repossessed, replaced by a modest sedan that reflected her new economic reality. David Morrison had fared even worse, his business partnerships dissolving once word spread about his involvement in a frivolous lawsuit that had cost him $15,000 in court fees plus his attorney's abandoned bills. The professional reputation he had built on inherited privilege and family connections crumbled when colleagues realized his judgment was fatally compromised by entitlement and false assumptions. His country club membership had been quietly suspended pending payment of overdue fees he could no longer afford. James Whitfield's legal career had suffered permanent damage from his spectacular failure to conduct basic title research before filing the property dispute. The State Bar Association had launched a formal investigation into his professional competence, and several clients had terminated their relationships once news of his courthouse humiliation spread through legal circles. The Bentley had been traded for a more modest vehicle, and his practice had been reduced to handling minor civil matters for clients who couldn't afford more reputable representation. Margaret had graciously allowed the siblings to visit their father's grave site on scheduled occasions, treating them with the courtesy she might show any other visitors to her property. These encounters were brief and formal, conducted with the polite distance appropriate between a property owner and guests who had previously overstepped their bounds. Richard's grave remained beautifully maintained, surrounded by flowers that Margaret planted and tended with the same care she had shown their father during his final years. The legal victory had also revealed Margaret's background in ways that surprised even her closest neighbors. Thomas Chun, far from being the bargain basement attorney he appeared, was actually a highly respected property law specialist who had worked with Margaret's first husband on various real estate investments. Her modest lifestyle and quiet demeanor had concealed a legal education and business acumen that she had chosen not to display during her marriage to Richard, preferring to focus on his care and comfort rather than asserting her professional credentials. During a recent neighborhood gathering, Margaret had quietly mentioned her plans to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing legal education, particularly those from modest backgrounds who might otherwise lack access to quality representation. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the woman Rachel and David had dismissed as powerless was actually in a position to help others avoid the kind of legal vulnerability they had tried to exploit. The Riverside Manor estate had undergone subtle improvements since the legal resolution, with Margaret finally feeling free to make changes that reflected her own taste rather than deferring to Richard's children's probable objections. New garden beds had been planted with varieties that attracted butterflies and songbirds, creating a peaceful sanctuary that honored both her first husband's memory and her own dreams for the property's future. On quiet evenings, Margaret often sat on the front porch where Richard had enjoyed watching sunsets during his healthier days, remembering both the joy and sorrow that had shaped her life in this house. She felt no bitterness toward his children, understanding that grief and misplaced entitlement had clouded their judgment more than pure malice. Their treatment of her had been cruel, but she had learned long ago that harboring resentment only poisoned the person carrying it. The community's perception of Margaret had evolved from sympathetic concern for a vulnerable widow to respectful recognition of a woman who had navigated complex family dynamics with remarkable grace under pressure. Local business owners who had heard the courthouse story began consulting her informally about legal matters, discovering that her quiet expertise extended far beyond property law into areas of contract negotiation and estate planning. What struck people most about Margaret's handling of her vindication was her complete lack of triumphalism or desire for revenge beyond the natural consequences of the siblings' own poor choices. She had not sought publicity or attempted to further humiliate Rachel and David beyond the court-ordered resolution of their harassment. Instead, she had quietly resumed the life she had built with care and intention, allowing her actions to speak louder than any words of condemnation. The legal fees that Rachel and David struggled to pay served as a daily reminder of the cost of assumptions and arrogance, while Margaret's peaceful enjoyment of her rightfully owned property demonstrated the quiet power of patience and preparation. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through the simple revelation of truth, proving that sometimes the most devastating defeats come from having one's own illusions shattered by reality. As autumn approached and the oak trees began showing hints of gold among their green leaves, Margaret reflected on how the crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than diminished her connection to the home she had shared with two beloved husbands. The property that Richard's children had tried to claim through intimidation and false legal action now stood as testament to the enduring power of love, legal preparation, and quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. Speaking of justice and family drama, what did you think about how this whole situation unfolded? Have you ever dealt with people who made assumptions about your situation that turned out to be completely wrong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about Margaret's incredible patience and how satisfying that courtroom reversal must have been.